Hi, welcome back to week 3. So we finished up looking at all the different parts of plants in the last couple of lectures, and starting from this week and the weeks after this, we will start looking at different species of plants, trees and shrubs that grow in the Pacific Northwest. So this week we will be covering conifers, which are also known as gymnosperms. These are things like your pines, your firs, your spruces. And then next week we will start looking at broadleaf species, or angiosperms, and these are species with bigger typical leaf-shaped leaves like oaks and maples. Okay, so next up, let's just review a few terms here on what a gymnosperm is, what a conifer is. So gymnosperms are plants that don't make flowers, and the angiosperms are the plants that do make flowers. So if you look at all the gymnosperms, or plants that don't have flowers on them, there's 4 different kinds of gymnosperms. There's conifers, cycads, ginkgos, and atales, and we will just be looking at conifers in this class. Now, all these, usually a flowering plant, the goal of the flower is to develop a seed inside that will grow into a new plant. Now, in conifers, most of the conifers produce their seeds instead of in a flower. They produce it in a cone or some other type of hardwoody structure. A few of them, the conifers, produce berry-like structures to protect the seeds that look more like berries. And for example, we call juniper berries, we call them berries, even though they're not really berries, but they don't really look like a typical hardwoody cone either. Now remember, as you're going through your key, that as we talk about terms like needles, scales, and awls, these are all types of leaves. So if you see the word leaf or leaves, a pine needle is a leaf, or a scale on a juniper tree is a type of a leaf. So it's a structure on that plant that's designed to do photosynthesis and capture sunlight. But anytime you see that term leaf, we turn to think of needles as something different, but needles and scales and awls are all different types of leaves when you're looking at conifers. So there's a list of all the different common conifers in your text on page 27 to 28. And these are the trees that grow mostly within the region of the Pacific Northwest. Not all of them grow native within Oregon, but a lot of them you'll see planted around. So you may see trees, even though they don't naturally grow in this area, you might see things people have planted around town. So that list will cover most of the things that you probably will see around town. So I would recommend just looking through that list, seeing how many of these names you recognize. Some of them we've heard, but we don't necessarily know what they look like. So it's good to just get familiar with what the names are of the different plants as we go through those. So a few tips on keying, and you'll be keying again for this lab this week and really every other lab after this week. Once you key your plant to the genus name, I would recommend, so you're going to start on your key on page 35. The goal of that key is to key your plant out to genus. So for example, is it a pine? Is it a fir? Is it a spruce? Those are all different types of genera or the genus. So I would recommend if you get to the genus, so for example, if you key out your plant and it says it's a pine, look up pictures of a pine, look up pine, and just see, does it look sort of like that, to make sure you're on the right track before you move on to the genus key to get down to the species name. So if it does look like those plants, you're probably on the right track. So go ahead and follow the key. It'll tell you, so for example, if you key it to pine, it'll tell you what page to go to find out what kind of pine it is. If your plant is not looking at all like plants in that genus, then you might want to try working through the key again to see where you went wrong, rather than trying to force the key if you're not at the right place in the key. So the concept of keying is really simple. You're just answering the question. Is it part 1 of the question or part 2 of the question? And then going to the page number that it tells you to go to. But keying itself can actually be really tricky because there's so many terms that you have to know, and sometimes it's hard to tell on your plant. Is it an awl? Is it a scale? And so, or you might see awls and scales. And so sometimes it gets tricky as you're going through the key. So give yourself plenty of time. Don't assume you're going to work through it in 10 minutes. And if you do get stuck along the way, as I mentioned, please feel free to ask for help.
at any point along the way in your keying. So once you do get to the genus and species name, so for example, let's say that your key says the ponderosa pine, then look again at some pictures of that and make sure that that actually does look like your plant. And that's just a good kind of way to check yourself and see if you hopefully went through the key correctly. One site that's interesting to look at is this site here, and the site down here at the bottom. And it has kind of a nice map of Oregon and all the different types of forests that occur in Oregon. So if you look at these colors on the right, it'll show you, or sorry, these colors kind of to the right of the pictures, you can see. So for example, this purple here is Siskiyou mixed conifer forest, and that's in this region here. The red here are subalpine forests, and you have that in this region. Kind of hard to tell the difference between the purple and the blue, but in a lot of this blue, you have the western juniper forests. And so what you can do is actually click on the area where you're at. So for example, you could click around the Klamath Falls region, and it would tell you a list of the main conifer types of trees that are in that area. And so if you did travel to over towards Medford or something, you could click on that area and see what types of plants you might expect over there. So just a good reference if you want a list of the conifers in the area that you are either in or visiting. Now, page 45 is another useful key to help you kind of sort of work through the key quickly if you know some specific features of your plant. So again, it's on page 45, and it just gives you different traits. Like for example, the only conifer with deciduous leaves, which means they lose their needles in the winter, is the larch, or genus Larix. And they only natively grow in very northern Oregon. So if you were just out in the forest, you probably are not going to see that around Klamath Falls. But they have planted them around town in various places and around different towns around here. So if you see a plant that has lost its needles, then that's the only conifer that does that in this region. If you see scales, so these are needles here, they're long and slender. Scales are sort of fat, and it looks like a whole bunch of little pieces or segments have been kind of crammed together to make up a longer structure, and those are called scales. And so if you see a scale, it's either one of the false cedars. So there's false cypress, there's incense cedar, there's western red cedar, or it's a cypress or juniper. So if you see scales, you can rule down and know that it's one of these types of plants here. So we're going to start by covering the conifers that have scales and awls, and then we'll move on to the conifers that have needle-like leaves. So if you see only scales on a plant, you either have a juniper, cypress, giant sequoia, false cypress or white cedar, incense cedar, or western red cedar. If you see awls or awls and scales on the same plant, then you have a juniper, cypress, or a giant sequoia. This is just a table of whether the plants that with scales and awls are found native in Klamath County. And again, you could see other plants of these planted around town, but the junipers and incense cedar are found native to Klamath County. The other plants with scales and awls are not native to Klamath County, but again, you could find them growing around town. Okay, so first we'll cover the junipers, and junipers are in the family Cupressaceae, and junipers can be monoecious or dioecious. And monoecious would mean that they have male and female cones on one tree. Dioecious would mean they have separate male and female trees. Depending on what species of juniper you're looking at, would depend on whether they're monoecious or dioecious. If you're looking at a tree but you don't see these typical cones, you just see this sort of structure, then you could be looking at a male tree. So again, the juniper cones are often referred to as berries, even though technically they are not berries. So here's a map of where the junipers grow, their counties that they grow in. And as you can see, the common juniper and the western juniper do grow in Klamath County. The other junipers do not grow native in Klamath County. So if you see a juniper while you're out driving around, most likely, if you're around Klamath County, you're seeing either the common juniper or the western juniper. So junipers overall, most of them have this kind of look here. Kind of a tree that's not super tall, and sort of that grayish greenish look. That's most likely what you'll see around your area. The western juniper has scale, so it can either have just scale-like leaves, or you might see some scale and some awl-like leaves mixed together. And it has these characteristic resin dots on them, and those are these white things. And you kind of have to look up really close to see the white resin dots, and that's what gives the tree kind of the grayish appearance overall. The Rocky Mountain juniper does not have these resin dots, otherwise it looks kind of similar. So it's a tree about 20 to 60 feet tall, 1 to 3 feet in diameter, and sort of a gray to blue-green color. If you're just starting to look at trees, some people confuse this with the incense cedar, and this is more of a yellow-green color, so much more green rather than the gray color. And there are the berries for what the common juniper looks like. And they start out sort of, as I mentioned, sort of greenish, and as they develop, they'll get this waxy coating, and you can see where that's been rubbed off a little bit here. And that will give them this real purplish to grayish color as that waxy coating develops. Now the common juniper is actually this shrubby looking thing, and so it forms sort of a mat. Sometimes can be up to 30 feet tall. But generally you get more of this matted shape, and it has linear leaves, so it has leaves like this, so sort of pointy, more needle-like leaves and not scales. So this juniper is a little bit different looking than the other junipers. It still has those characteristic sort of berry-like cone structures. Now the incense cedar has small scale-like leaves, sort of like the juniper. As you can see, looking up close, they look a little bit different. They're a little longer and narrower than each scale. So here's a scale, like right there's one scale. There's another scale, a little longer and narrower than the juniper. They get up to 70 to 110 feet tall, so quite a bit taller than the juniper. And they have sort of this thick, purplish reddish bark. It kind of gets grayer color when it gets older, with deep ridges in it when it's older, kind of flaky when it's younger. And the scales are longer than they are wide, and the leaves tend to lay flat on the branch. I think that's one of the characteristics in your key right away, is to determine if the leaves sprawl out flat. And as you can see in this picture, they sort of, if you were to lay that leaf on a piece of paper, it would sort of, or that, sorry, set of leaves, that branch, it would lay pretty flat. Now the cypress is not naturally found in Klamath County, but you definitely could see them planted around. It has cones that definitely look different than the juniper or the cedar, these sort of round, woody structures. And it might look similar to the juniper just glancing at it. So the scale-like leaves can kind of have that grayish, greenish color. But if you can find the cones are the female cones are very different. And then here's the male cones, these yellow ones here. The female cones tend to be about 1/2 inch to 1.5 inch in diameter. Okay, next we have what they call a false cedar. And this is Chamois cyparis. And it's going to follow a similar path in the key to the incense cedar, but the scales are about twice as wide, and they're not wine or goblet shaped. So in the cedar, they say that they're kind of wine or goblet shaped scales. The false cedar here, there's two types of false cedars, Alaska cedar and Port Orford cedar, that are in this region, and they have the scales that are not quite as long and narrow. They're a little bit shorter. The cones, you get these kind of round woody cones, sort of like the cypress. The Alaska cedar, you don't see white X's on the underside, so no white X's here. On the Port Orford cedar, you can see sort of these white X's on the underside, and that's a good way to tell apart the Port Orford cedar from the Alaska cedar. Okay, so next up we have the giant sequoia, which is Sequoia dendron giganteum, and it's not native to Oregon or Klamath County, but sometimes you will see it around planted. It's very tall, so it's the tallest of the conifers that we'll cover, 200 to 300 feet tall, and 10 to 20 feet in diameter. Scale-like or awl-like leaves that are arranged spirally, and so as you look up the branch, the leaves sort of seem to spiral around, and it has large egg-shaped cones. The redwood is Sequoia sempervirens, and it's also another really tall tree. It's 180 to 370 feet tall, 8 to 23 feet in diameter, dark reddish brown bark. The female cones are about 1 inch long and reddish brown to brown. You can see what they look like in the picture down here. And the male cones are small and sort of yellowish. You can see the male cones down here. And the leaves are linear to lanceolate and held tightly to the twig. So they'll actually tear part of the twig when you pull them off. So a good characteristic if you wonder if you have a redwood is to try to pull that needle off and see if it pulls part of the twig off with it. And they are found just a little ways in Oregon, mostly along this coast here, and then just a little bit along the Oregon-Washington border there. The western red cedar is about 150 to 200 feet tall, 3 to 10 feet in diameter, and it is found in Oregon, not native in Klamath County, but in counties close by. And the leaves are scale-like and decussate, which means that it has opposite leaves with each pair perpendicular to the one above and below it. The wood is really durable, so most wood shingles and shakes made in Oregon and Washington are made from the western red cedar. Okay, so next we're going to be covering the pines, and we're moving on to the family Pinaceae, and the pines are the genus Pinus. So if you see needles in fascicles, which means a bunch, so if you are going through your key and it asks are your needles in fascicles, that means a bunch. So when you pull the needle off the tree, it's kind of held at the bottom together in a group of 2 or more needles. So the different pine species that we have around here are the white bark pine, knobcone pine, lodgepole pine, sugar pine, western white pine, and ponderosa pine. You also could see Jeffrey pine and limber pine planted around. So there's 2 different categories of pines. There's white pines and what they call the white pines and what they call the yellow pines. And white pines all have 5 needles per fascicle or per bundle, and the twigs tend to be smooth. The yellow pines have 2 to 3 needles per fascicle or bundle, and the twigs are scaly. So the white pines include the western white pine, sugar pine, white bark pine, and limber pine. The yellow pines include the knobcone pine, lodgepole pine, Jeffrey pine, and ponderosa pine. So let's look at the yellow pines first. The ponderosa pine and the Jeffrey pine actually look pretty similar. The ponderosa pine and the Jeffrey pine have usually 3 needles per fascicle. Sometimes you might find 2 needles per fascicle. The main difference is the cones in the ponderosa pine are about 3 to 5 inches long and prickly when you pick them up, so you can actually feel on the end. Definitely will feel a sharp point there on the ends of the cones. The cones in the Jeffrey pine are 5 to 9 inches long and not prickly when you pick them up. So the ponderosa gets the phrase prickly ponderosa, and then Jeffrey gets the term gentle Jeffrey based on their cones being prickly or not prickly. If you cut a twig of the ponderosa pine, they have kind of a stronger smell like turpentine. The Jeffrey pines tend to have a sweet smell that some people think smells like vanilla, and some people think smells sort of like butterscotch, but it's definitely a sweet smell. The bark on the ponderosa pine is brown to almost kind of black looking, and I kind of think the top looks like the top of brownies. Maybe I'm just hungry when I'm out, but let's see. So Jeffrey pines are not found native in Klamath County, but you might see them planted, and they're not too far away. Okay, The rest of the yellow pines, we have the knobcone pine, and this is short to medium height, so about 40 to 80 feet tall. Has 3 needles per fascicle that are generally about 3 to 7 inches long. The needles tend to be a little shorter than the ponderosa, but longer than the lodgepole. And the cones will only open and fire. So no matter when you're looking at these cones, you will see these very closed cones. So other trees, the cones might look closed when they're first developing, but they'll definitely open up as the cones develop, and the cones you see laying on the ground will look more open. Knobcone pines have pine cones that are always going to look closed up unless they've been in a fire. So you tend to see these species coming out after a fire. They'll be one of the first trees to grow because their cones will open up at that point. And you tend to see the cones sort of arranged real close to the trunk of the tree like this. That's a good characteristic of the knobcone pine. The lodgepole pine is another tree that's not too tall. It's about 30 to 100 feet tall. And inland, it tends to grow tall and straight in dense, even age stands. So you'll see a whole bunch of trees that look about the same age. It has what they call this cornflake-looking bark. These little tiny kind of flaky pieces that sort of look like cornflakes pressed on the tree. The needles are in 2 per fascicle, and they're pretty short compared to a lot of the pines. They're about 1 inch to 2, or sorry, the needles are, the cones are about 1 inch to 2 inches long. The needles, you'll probably see about 2 to 3 inch long needles, and again, 2 per fascicle. And you do see these in Klamath County, along with the knobcone pines. Okay, so the last group we'll look at today are the white pines, and we have first the western white pine, getting to a little taller pines here, about 120 to 180 feet tall, 5 needles per fascicle. So again, with the white pines, we're looking at all 5 needles per fascicle. The needles are generally about 2 to 4 inches long, and it has white lines on the 2 inner surfaces only. You can kind of tell in this picture, you can see the white lines right here on these inner surfaces, but these outer surfaces of the needle, you do not see the white lines. The cones are about 5 to 12 inches long, and they're sort of a little bit, you can see this curved shape here, and they are found in Klamath County. The sugar pine is 150 to over 200 feet tall. Also has 5 needles per fascicle, needles that are about 2 to 4 inches long. So we're sounding kind of similar to the western white pine. The main difference is it has white lines on all surfaces. So if you were to look at the needles, this is the white pine here, but you'd see white lines here on this undersurface and this upper surface of the needles. And has cones. If you do have a cone, that's pretty much a giveaway at the sugar pine because they have these very long cones that are 10 to 18 inches long and pretty straight. And they are also found in Klamath County. The last of our 2 white pines, we have the white bark pine and the limber pine. They're both about 20 to 50 feet tall. The white bark pine is found in Klamath County. The limber pine is usually found in northeastern Oregon to the Rocky Mountains, so not in Klamath County. And limber pine usually at very high altitude. So going back to the white bark pine, it has needle clusters near the tip of the branches with, again, because it's a white pine, 5 needles per fascicle. The needles are about 1 to 3 inches long. And the cones are about 1.5 to 3 inches long. And you can see the sort of purplish color, purplish brown color of the cone at maturity. Limber pine also has 5 needles per fascicle. The branches, though, if you try to bend them, are very flexible, which is why they call it the limber pine.
Okay, so this week in lecture we're covering firs, larch, spruce, hemlock, and yew. And these are all the conifers in the second half of your key, pages 37 and 38. And these species all pretty much have needles or leaves that are shorter than the pines that we covered last week. First up, we have Douglas fir. A lot of people just call it Doug fir. And the scientific name is Pseudotsuga menziesii. And this is not a true fir. True firs are of the genus Abies. But it has needles that look a lot like a fir. And so that's why its common name is fir. So if you go to question 16 in your key, you'll get taken to Doug fir, and it discusses bracts and scales. So sometimes they call the bract a bract scale, and the bract sits below the scale. So if this is your scale, these kind of flat round things, these are your scales, and then the bract scale is this lighter colored piece right here. And in the Doug fir, a good way to identify the Doug fir is they're the only cone that really looks like this at all, and they have these distinct three-pronged bracts. So if you look at the top here, we have 1, 2, 3 prongs, or you can see it a little more clearly here, 1, 2, 3 prongs on those bracts. So if you can find a cone and you see cones that have these bracts sticking out that look like that, then that's a good way to know that you have a Doug fir. Here in this picture is a picture of what the male and female cones look like in April. So you'd know what it would look like if you found it now. And the cones look a lot different than, at least for the female cones, than they would if you found them later. So again, if you find an old cone on the ground, sometimes those are better for these distinguishing characteristics than looking at the cones in the spring when they're just developing. If you were to Google Doug fir, you'd see a lot of Christmas trees, and that's because they are the most common Christmas tree species.
So I just want to point out there's an error in your key on page 75, the key to the firs. So if you could go to that page and make a note or stick a post-it in there or something to remind you that if you get to question number 3, the first question should say base of needles shaped like a hockey stick, L-shaped, terminal twigs reddish brown. So if you could make that correction there, so if you do get to a fir that you're keying out and get to question 3, you'll have that change there in your text.
Next, let's look at the true firs. And what makes something a true fir is if it's in the genus Aves. And the true firs include things like white fir, red fir, and silver fir. They don't include the Doug fir, which, as we just talked about, is the genus Pseudotsuga. And that's not a true fir because it's not in the genus Aves. So the true firs have characteristics of having shorter leaves, so they're typically close to 1 inch long needles. The leaves or needles cover most of the branch. The cones sit erect in the top portion of the tree. So if you look at this picture here, you can see in the top portion of the tree, you see the cones, and they're sitting facing upwards rather than hanging down like a lot of other cones do in a lot of other species. The cones usually fall apart when they're mature, so you don't typically see intact cones very often on the ground. You might find a few, but most likely they'll be fallen apart on the ground. The twigs are fairly smooth and may be resinous, so as you can see here in this picture, there's some little dots where there's resin here, where the needles fell off. The leaf scars, where you can see this resin, are usually round and flat, and they're distinctive of this genus. Let's look next at how to tell the firs apart. And many of the firs look really similar, and the needle characteristics are the best way to tell them apart. So your key starts out with the first characteristic in the key that it will ask you about when you get to the fir key, is if there is bloom on the upper surface. And what bloom means is, you can see these fir needles here that look very green. That would be an example of not having bloom on that surface. These down here that have these whitish looking lines, that's what they refer to as bloom. So keep in mind this refers in your key to the upper side. So for this question on the key, it's not referring to whether or not the bottom of the needle has the white lines, but just whether the top of the needle has the white lines. So all firs in Klamath County or all firs in your text are present in Klamath County except the grand fir, but it is nearby. So if you're looking in Klamath County, not as likely you'll see the grand fir growing out like in the forest. It might have been planted, but you certainly could find it close by Klamath County. So when you get to that question, if you do not see white bloom or lines on the upper surface, so if you're looking down at the branch, so for example, this branch right here growing on the tree, you're looking down this way, or this branch here, you're looking down this way, and you don't see white bloom on that upper surface, then it's either grand fir or silver fir. And the silver fir, if you remember what 2 ranked means, it means the needles just grow off sort of perpendicular to the branch, and the needles look flat as you look across. Whereas and that would be silver fir if it looks 2 ranked like that. The grand fir is not two-ranked, so the needles are growing off in many different directions, sort of looking all like they're growing off all around the stem. And as I mentioned, the grand fir is not doesn't naturally grow in Klamath County. It certainly could have been planted or being nearby. So again, the grand fir and the silver fir are the two that when you look at them, you're not going to see the white bloom or white lines on the upper surface. Now, if you do see white bloom on the upper surface, then you and they have hockey stick shaped needles with reddish colored twigs, then you're either going to be looking at red fir or noble fir. And in red fir, the needles in the cross section are ridged or raised along the midrib. So if you were to look at a needle and imagine cutting it across the needle, you'd see it raised in the middle of the needle. So if you took a needle and cut it like right across here, you should see it raised in the middle. The noble fir, the needle cross section is slightly grooved or indented along the middle section. So if you cut it along that section here, you'd see a slight groove down along the middle. Red fir is typically found only very high in elevation, like around 7,000 feet or higher. Now, if you have white bloom above, but you have straight needles and not hockey stick shaped needles, then you could either be looking at alpine fir or white fir. And in the alpine fir, the needles are pretty short. They're about 1 inch long. They're densely packed on the stem and they sweep upwards. In the white fir, the needles are a little bit longer. It may be hard to tell because some white firs may have shorter needles on the spectrum, but generally they're going to be about 1.5 to 3 inches long. On average, they'll be closer to 2 inches long. The leaves are, these needles are much more loosely packed, and they may look two-ranked. Sometimes they don't look as two-ranked as others when they're really upswept. Sometimes it's hard to tell if they're two-ranked. Sometimes they look very two-ranked like this, but in general, just not as densely packed as the alpine fir, which is pretty densely packed here.
Next we have the larches, and they're the only deciduous conifer in this region, which means they lose their leaves in the fall. So that makes them pretty different from all of the other conifers, which will keep their needles all year long. So we have two larches in this general region, the subalpine larch and the western larch, and they are not in this area specifically, but they are close by. They're not right in Klamath, but they are in the general surrounding area. The subalpine larch is found growing naturally in the forests in Washington, Idaho, and Montana, whereas the western larch does go into Oregon a little bit, just not all the way to the south part of the state. The main distinguishing feature between the two larches is whether or not they have woolly twigs. And so on the subalpine larch, a young twig has little woolly white hairs all over it. It's hard to see in the picture here, but that white look is little fine woolly hairs. And the young twigs in the western larch are smooth and shiny. They don't have those white woolly hairs. The cones of the larches, this is a young cone developing here. So the first year cone, and this is a previous year's cone. So they have quite a different look as the cones develop. So if you see this looking structure on some kind of conifer, then that would indicate that you have a larch. Here's another larch picture, kind of pretty with the larches changing color. And so you can see all the trees that are larches here in the fall changing color and losing their leaves. Next, let's move on to spruce. And spruces, to get to the spruces in question number 13 in the conifer key on page 37, it asks you if woody pegs are easily seen. And so what they're referring to there is, if you see the needles here, you can see these little woody pegs. They're a different color coming off the branch. And so you can see in the spruces, they're the only genus that has these real distinct woody pegs. And they're actually projections of the stem, and so when you pull it off, they won't necessarily pull off very easily, but that's part of the stem coming up, so it's the same color as the stem. And it also says that they are not ternate, and ternate means arranged in whorls of 3, or 3 leaves coming off around the stem at the same point. different spruces that we have are the Sitka spruce, Engelmann spruce, and weeping spruce. And on the Sitka spruce, the needles mostly point out. So if you look at the Sitka spruce right here, the needles are for the most part pointing outward or away from the stem, whereas in the Engelmann spruce, the needles are somewhat angled upwards from the stem. In the Sitka spruce, the tip of the needles is sharp, as it is with the Engelmann spruce. And so the main difference, they're both sharp, the Engelmann and the Sitka spruce on the ends, but the main difference is going to be the directions of the needles point. And the Engelmann spruce also smells bad when you crush the leaves. So if you crush the leaves and have a bad odor, it might be likely that you have the Engelmann spruce. The weeping spruce, the tip of the needles is not sharp. If you look at the whole tree overall, it has a really different look from the other two spruces. All the little branchlets coming off the main branch here droop down, and so it has that weepy look. And again, if you touch the tip of the needles on the weeping spruce, they are not sharp. Next, we'll move on to the hemlock, genus Tsuga. And compared to the spruces, the woody pegs are not as obvious. So if you look at this, it may look like it has somewhat of a real narrow base there where the leaf joins to the stem, but it's not. It doesn't look as much like a woody peg. And the needles tend to be shorter in the hemlocks, less than 3/4 of an inch. So really, it's a little more obvious on this picture here, but very short needles compared to the spruces. And the buds are also very small. Both of the hemlock species that are in Klamath County, and they tend to grow in moist areas. This picture on top here shows you a developing female cone in the spring. And again, this is really zoomed in, so it looks big, but it's really not all that large. And then this would be your mature female cones here. So our two hemlocks are the western hemlock and the mountain hemlock. And so western hemlock is Tsuga heterophylla. The leaves are flat. The cones are less than 1 inch. And they tend to be two-ranked, which again, that means that they stick out. They kind of look flat along. As you look down at the stem, they tend to stick out, to the left and to the right, but not be rolled all around the stem. The mountain hemlock has thicker leaves, and the cones are larger than 1 inch, up to 3 inches, and they are not two-ranked. So if you look at this, the needles tend to come off kind of in all directions. And so not obviously two-ranked like the western hemlock is. Next here we have the yew, and the yew has cones that are called arils, and they're a red berry-looking structure. This makes identification really easy if you do see these red berry-like structures that you've got a yew. So none of the other conifers have these structures. If there are no berries and you see a conifer that you don't obviously have the berries, then some other characteristics of the yew are that they have flat needles like a fir. The needles don't have white bloom, so they don't have those white lines on them. Looks somewhat yellowish lines, but not that obviously white lines on them like a fir. And the needles go up along the stem before going out. So the needles kind of go up like this and then go out. And the tips are pointed but not sharp like most of the hemlocks and the nutmeg or toria. So needles are pointed but not so pointy that they will like needle sharp at the end. Next we have the California nutmeg, and this is not native to Oregon or Washington, but you may see it growing or planted in places. The needles are very, very sharp, so if you poke it will poke through your skin. The needles are dark green above and have 2 white lines or rows of bloom beneath. And the tree is 35 to 50 feet tall and 8 to 20 inches in diameter. And it has an aril, but not the red berry-like aril. Their aril looks more like an olive.
Just a few tips when you're out there hunting for conifers. So if you go out trying to collect your conifer species, the cones may be growing right now and may be smaller than a fully developed cone. So if you're trying to measure the length of the cone for a characteristic, it's a good idea to try to find a dropped cone on the ground so you can find a cone that is fully mature and the full length. Most of the questions on the key are based on leaf and cone features. If you don't do your keying in the field, which most of you probably won't do, then make sure that you bring home that average size cone and a section of leaves large enough to show the overall arrangement of the leaves. So for example, some of them say are the leaves, spiraled around the branch. So you may want to leave one sample of your conifer unpressed until you keyed it to look at this arrangement. And a picture of the overall tree can be helpful in identifying it if you get stuck in the key. So if you are not sure where you're going in the key, but you think it's maybe you're trying to determine which type of pine it is, sometimes just looking at the pictures can be helpful in ruling out some of the pines and helping you get through the key. If you can't, for some reason, get your plant keyed to species, but you can get to the genus name, you would write it as, you'd put the genus name and then SP for species. So for example, Pinus spa or Juniperus spa. So if you can have a couple of these in your collection if you need to, where you don't get to species. This more applies to the broadleaf plants. For example, there's a lot of willows that you won't key out just because the willows there's tons of them and they're not all in your keying those out. So a few of the species you may not get to the species name. You just get the genus name. And again, probably not so much for the conifers. So hopefully for the conifers, you will get the genus and the species name for your plants. Okay, so for some of you, it might be helpful to just look at these plants in person rather than just a picture. And especially if you're not familiar with a lot of these plants. So taking a trip to the nursery can be a great place to look at plants. So most of these plants aren't fully grown, so you won't get maybe an idea of the height or all the cones, but you can get an idea of what the needles look like and see the scale-like needles, the awl-like needles, the longer needles. So there's several nurseries around town that you could try looking at, and I don't think they're going to want you collecting their plants samples there, but they can be a great place to just go look, so you get an idea when you go out to the field what the different trees, what the needles look like. Field identification may not be necessary for you to know for this class, but if you plan on working in the field, then you may need to identify trees that you see out in the field. So for example, if you're surveying different plant species, getting familiar with the overall look of a tree can be very helpful. So trees have a look, just looking at them at distance, when you get familiar with them, that you can recognize and go, oh, that's a pine or a fir or a cedar. And you'll get much better at this with time, but it helps to take a good look at the tree you've identified from a distance to get a feel for the overall look, shape, color of the tree and the bark and the cones. So it's usually best or easiest to learn the most common trees in your area, and then you'll recognize when there's a tree that you don't know, then you can look those up. So eventually you'd hopefully get familiar with the most common trees, and then you won't have to be looking everything up when you're in the field. Sometimes in the field you won't have everything that you need to fully identify the plant, but still getting just to the genus, so saying Pinus spa, can be useful information depending on what kind of work you're doing. Okay, so plant symbols are also used a lot if you're doing field work because they're a lot easier. You don't have to know these for this class, but just for your information. All plants are given a 4 or 5 letter and possibly number symbol. So you can see the symbol in the USDA plants website. And if you have a lot of plants that you're identifying, say you're doing a survey form and you need to know all the plants in an area, just writing out the symbol can be a lot easier than writing the whole name, such as writing out Pinus ponderosa. The symbol is usually the first 2 letters of the genus name and the first 2 letters of the species name, unless 2 plants have the same 4 letters, and then they'll start putting a number after it. And a plant with a subspecies or variety would have an additional 5th letter for the subspecies. So for example, Pinus ponderosa, you take the first 2 letters of the genus, first 2 letters of your species, and you get PIPO. And if you were looking at Pinus ponderosa variety ponderosa, then you would take that additional 5th letter here and you'd have PIPOP. The incense cedar is Calicedrus decurrens, and that you have CADE, but there are a lot of CADE abbreviations for plants. So Calisandra occurrence is CADE 27. Now, unless you come across these plants a lot, you won't typically remember all these numbers, but they do have code books if you were working in the field that have all the codes for all these plants. And again, like I said, they're on the USDA plants website. So this is just an easier way that if you are doing field work and writing down plant names, just want you to have that information in case you ever are in that situation, and you'll know what these plant codes are.
That's the end of our week 3 lecture. As you go about trying to key out your conifers this week, please let me know if you have any questions or need help as you're going with the key. It's always nice to have a picture, especially if you have a question in a certain section, to take a picture of that and send that to me through an email or a text message as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Otherwise, I will be in touch with you again next week.